Okay. Wow. There's a lot that's already the two of them have covered. And I don't think I'm going to say anything new beyond that, to be very honest. Um, Actually, the topic of this, demand for transgender rights and democracy. Um, I So the thing is, the fact that we have to demand rights is very absurd to me in itself, and I think everyone finds that absurd. Um, because, how do I say this? Because, and we've talked about this a lot, where the identity of a transgender person, as we see right now in our country, is an exclusionary category, irrespective of the rights we have, article, whatever. It's still an exclusionary right to be able to identify in this country as a transgender person legally, comes from an exclusionary law that's outside of it. You're not naturally recognized as who you are, and it inherently puts us as an exceptional category. It is automatically outside. It's like when you are a citizen, when you are a person in this country, and which naturally comes with its rights, what then, okay, when you are naturally a citizen of this country, with it comes rights, but then what happens when you are an exclusionary category? Is there a question of demand? Because who are we demanding this from? We are consistently negotiating with the state. I mean, like, our daily existence has been a negotiation. Each and every conversation, whether it be in the previous panel or the ones that we're going to have, is a negotiation. Our daily lives are a negotiation. Whether it be education, healthcare, etc., where we're trying to find loopholes, we're trying to make it work, we're trying to get new policies, etc., in place to find space, right? And that being our space, that being a space in the larger terms of the democracy, when we talk about the state in terms of the country, right? But also, what I wanted to talk about was the implications of our negotiation with the state, with how we work, negotiation with the state, negotiation with democracy, and how we as a quote-unquote community work with democracy. We always talk about trans community, LGBTQ community, and of course, there have been a lot of conversations on what this idea of community itself means. Does it mean anything? You could call it solidarities, but what exactly it means? Which is why I wanted to talk about pride here, because taking that as an example for a lot of like metropolitan cities, etc., as a space where you are actively seeing quote-unquote community organization, seeing people foot on ground, trying to organize, trying to get together, be it for visibility, be it for whatever purpose, and pride as that site of organization. And what does that actually reveal about how we are seeing democracy within this quote-unquote community? We all know the history of where pride came from, and clearly the way, especially our Indian metropolitan cities, the pride we see is way further away from that. Most likely we see pride as a celebration now, which I don't know what we are celebrating, to be very honest, with the act and everything that we have right now. Especially as a trans person, I genuinely don't know what we are celebrating. Which is also a question, right? Because this space that is a pride is not just for a trans person. It is LGBTQI, alphabet soup. And the idea of that pride has always been of coming together, solidarity, organization. But within that, we can also find state. And because we as people would reflect how our negotiation and the impact that state has on us, and state in terms of government or bureaucracy, how that implementation comes into our organization as well and our democracy as well. And it's been very, not very prominent, but it's been visible. be it in Calcutta Pride a few years ago, where there were hassles with conducting of Pride on you can't do this, you can't walk here, you can't do this, or very recently Pune Pride, where people who cross-dressed were not allowed. Conversations on who this year, conversations on can you organize a Pride, can a collective organize a Pride, or can another group who's never done this before, can they organize Pride as well? Who has the ownership of organization of a community then? I actually can only speak from the perspective of my experience with Bombay Pride, because that's where I have been. And so Bombay Pride has also been a similar space. It's a collective of people. And but the idea is, again, democracy and access, right? About who has the ability to represent themselves, who has the information and access to be in that space, which again comes, as Pushpa said, privileged queers being able to know of each other. I think most importantly of knowing of each other. The whole idea of community is that we automatically know each other, and if I have any problem, I get to talk to another queer or trans person. Does not happen, realistically. At the end of the day, when you come out as a trans person or a queer person, you're most likely going to, most of the time, be an individual trying to figure out your space in this democracy and this society. So this access to come together, this access to be seen, to see other trans people, to communicate with them. And so that's a question of access. And that is something that we've been riddled with, and we've not exactly, because we're talking about trans democracy, we've not figured out that as a community either. And because that's also right, because we're talking about if the law recognizes XYZ as trans person and this does not, and it gives definitions by the NALSA. What we as a community also, or like, I think a mainstream community would be a better way to put it. Who do we recognize as a trans person as well? Do we actually understand, or do we actually practice that self-determination? And my perspective on that comes from in the last 2-3 years that I've been working within my city, trying to build a collective independent of mainstream organizing of queer people, trying to build a community outside of that, where the idea is not central to your need as a trans person, or the discrimination that you face, or your trouble. It's more of a space for joy, more for a space to be seen. Because I think being seen as a trans person, or being seen as a queer person within that community holds a lot of power in itself. So that is how, I am seeing that collective or community organization. So coming back to the point of mainstream collective organizing, it's also a conversation on power, because I'm not sure if NGOization is the right word here, but that is very much apparent when you talk about mainstream organizing, and which is a very gate-kept space, obviously. And there has been, what happens with that gate-kept space is, I think, like Christy was talking about, the expert and the beneficiary, where when a mainstream space that is organized is the experts. They know what is good for the trans community, they know what is good for the queer community. They will do XYZ programs, we are doing the research. And a lot of queer and trans people who have not found that space to be seen as one within this space. What about them? What of that voice? Does that person not have a voice? Or are we not seeing it? Or are we not hearing it? So that's where I think the finding the voice thing comes, right? It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of... but then within that, and what I've experienced personally within that space of like trying to find that voice or trying to, it's come from a lot of privilege, obviously. The privilege to be able to gate crash these spaces, to, you know, put my foot in the door to try to find this voice. But my experience has been things like you can't get away with playing the trans card everywhere, are things that are said to you. A lot of time, most of the times, as a non-binary person, the onus or the responsibility of explaining your identity, justifying your existence, I would put it as, is obvious, it's put on you. You're not a person standing here expressing your issue or your need or your right. You need to justify the same. And that, of course, comes into queer organizing, because it's not just, we're not organizing just because we're queer people or we're trans people. Everyone here also has other affiliations with them, be it your university, be it your workspace, be it your caste location. There is a lot of privilege that comes from other than your identity, irrespective of your queerness and transness, which itself obviously would contribute to the hierarchy of the to queer organizing. And that's the question, right? That's why we come back to that question of, like, if it's a democracy, and how are we seeing it as a democracy when we are talking about leadership? And are we talking about inclusion, or are we only talking about leadership? Are we talking about majority of people? If you're talking about majority of people, what about the people who don't have the right to be seen as one? Who we do not recognize as a trans person? Which kind of sounds absurd, because we essentially always talk about self-determination. Because self-determination sounds nice, not nice, I mean, self-determination is a very important aspect, but when we are trying to find space, it's often about the other person seeing you as well, like other group of people seeing you as well, which has been kind of an issue when we talk about trans communities and organizing. Just give me 1 second.
Take two.
Yeah, so basically the reason why I'm talking about this being an issue is because as of now, as I said, mainstream organizing has generally been around services. I understand, and it's completely valid, that this is because we're talking about discrimination, we're talking about rights. So services that trans people require, be that medical, legal, etc., etc. But organizing beyond services, but organizing for the purpose of the idea of community or kinship. Like, are we organizing for that kinship, or are we organizing for a particular service? But because how far is provision of a service going to take us? Is it going to fulfill any idea of a demand that's clearly not happening? And it's also, the question of this organization also comes together because it's also about rights beyond us just being a trans person. It's our rights with regards to citizenship, or it's our rights with regards to horizontal reservation. These are demand for rights that we have irrespective of being trans. It comes from our other identities. And when we try to talk about that, when trying to organize around that, we are not seeing that organization, that trans organization anymore, which we generally see when it comes to services. Essentially, because our organizing is mostly around services, right? One place where I have found very joy-inducing, getting together kind of organizing, which leads to much more things, including services, comes from a space of privilege, but has been this online space in the last 2 years. I was just talking to, there are people here who I've known for 2 years and have been great friends, but I've not met them. We've been able to organize, we've been able to be there for each other. People have contacted us, we've done things that we've never met. It's not been for a service, but there's still been a sense of community. And this probably does not, actually more kinship than community. But then that organization, as a kinship as well, has translated into services eventually for a common cause. We've been able to come together to do that. That's been the conversation on mutual aid. That's what we've been doing. So when you talk about trans democracy, not that I actually only have questions. I think everything I've been saying has just been questions. Where in the last 2 years, I've been thinking about if it is possible that a trans person who has been actively working for organizing, for like something as big as a pride, can be so easily excluded with a trans card. Like you can't play the trans card everywhere. Where, as Pushpesh talked about homo nationalism as well, where that kind of power is also brought in to that space. How is trans organization or like trans democracy, or that's what our imagination of how are we bringing that trans, quote unquote, transness together? Or is that a factor that brings us together, or how do we do that? That's a question. I don't really know about it, to be honest. But that's pretty much my thought on democracy.